Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today is a long-awaited update to my Reading Around the World challenge. So if you haven't already seen my previous videos about this challenge, I am trying to read a book from every single country in the world. And I've done a couple of videos on this already, and I used to post quite a lot about it on my TikTok channel, but I post a lot less over on TikTok now. Before we dive into the books that I've read and my thoughts on each of the books, I do want to say I have a couple of rules for this challenge for myself. So I am choosing to read books that are both based in the country and also the author is from that country or was born in that country. This is to make sure I'm focusing on trying to learn about the country from someone who actually lives there or was born there. It might be the case that not every single book fits squarely into those two rules, and if it doesn't, then please let me know. But that's the kind of guideline I use for this challenge. But many other people do this challenge, and lots of other people will make up their own rules as well. So if you do want to join the challenge, then you should just make up your own rules, because the important thing is having fun. So in this video, I'm going to be telling you each of the books that I've been reading for every single country, going to give you a little summary of what the book's about and also my own views on the book. So I'm not recommending every single book in this list because some of the books I read and they really weren't for me. So maybe it helps you if you're looking for books for different countries. And also if you're just interested in any of these countries, some of these books I would wholeheartedly recommend and give 5 out of 5 stars. So we're going to jump right in and start talking about the books in all of the countries. I'm going to split this video up by continent and I'm going to do it in the same order as my previous videos. If there are countries though that you're really excited to hear from and I don't mention them in this video, then I do recommend that you go and check out my previous video on this, because I did a very long video there where I also went through a whole pile of countries. But obviously, not every single country is going to be in this video. There's so many countries in the world, and I am doing territories as well. So by my count, there's over 200 countries that I'm doing. So not everything's going to be in one video, obviously. So the continent we should start with is the one I started with last time, and we're going to be starting with Africa. And I have read 3 new books to add to my Africa continent. So the first book that I want to talk about for Africa is Egypt, and the book that I read is Woman at Point Zero. This is a really skinny little book, and I read it very, very quickly. And I really wanted to read this one in particular because I heard that it had a feminist take, and there wasn't that many that I could find for Egypt that were written by women. This book is all about a woman, and when you find her, she is locked up in a prison cell and she is condemned to die the next day. And her crime is that she is a prostitute and that she has killed a pimp. This is set in Cairo, and you go back and learn about her childhood and the steps that it's taken for her to get to this point of being imprisoned. And it's told kind of from the perspective of a researcher who goes to talk to her and begins to interview her about her life. I really enjoyed reading this one. Not only is it short, but also I read it so quickly because it's written very simply, but it is very powerful. I can wholeheartedly recommend this one. It really goes into the cruelty that this woman has faced because of her position in society, because of the poverty in which she's grown up, and the choices that she has therefore made. I don't want to say too much else because, as I said, it's such a short book, but I would 100% recommend this if you're looking for a book for Egypt. So next up we have Algeria, and the next book that I want to talk about I actually would not wholeheartedly recommend. I was slightly disappointed in this book, and that book is A Bookshop in Algiers. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, honestly. I always feel like I stumble over the word Algiers. So this one says that it's going to be about this bookshop in Algiers, and it's basically about this man who opens up a bookshop in the 1930s, and then you're tracking this bookshop like through the decades. And I love books about that. I obviously love books, I love bookshops, and I thought it was going to be tracking the kind of the ups and downs of the country alongside this bookshop, and it kind of was. Just something was really missing for me with this one. It kind of wildly like went between quite like non-fiction and factual information about the country of Algeria and what it was going through, because during this time Algeria went through a revolution and a fight for independence, and all of that was interesting if a bit dryly written. But then when you came back to like the more novel kind of like less factual bits about the book, I just really wasn't connecting with the story of this bookshop. I didn't really like any of the characters. I feel like we didn't know them very well, and I just came away from this wishing that I had read a non-fiction essay about Algeria during this time instead of sitting down with this book, which I don't often feel, because I do feel like the whole reason I'm doing this challenge is because I think that reading novels about countries and ideas is such a good way to learn about them. But unfortunately, I was left a little bit cold with this one. And then the next one I want to talk about for Africa is Ethiopia. And actually, it's another one that I did not enjoy. I don't think I chose this book very well. I was thinking it was something that it wasn't. The book that I chose for Ethiopia is The Shadow King. For some reason, I thought this was going to be much more of an adventurous story. I was even thinking it might be like a fantasy story, but still based on the war that was going on in Ethiopia. But basically, this is set during Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in the 1930s. And it is all about what it means to be a woman at the time during this war, and also women who are going to war, who are actually fighting in this war. And I thought that, like, that sounds like such an interesting topic for me and something that I would really enjoy. Something about the writing style of this book, I found it like so impenetrable and hard to get into. I just could not connect and could not find myself caring. So I actually ended up putting this book down. Maybe I was just picking up at the wrong time in my life and it just wasn't the right book at the right time. I might go back to this if other people really recommend this to me. But if you have another suggestion for Ethiopia, then I'm all ears as well. So that's it for the Africa continent. I did a lot in my previous video if you want to go and watch that. Next up, let's talk about Europe. And I have a lot of updates in this section. So the first country that I want to talk about for Europe is Bulgaria. And the book that I read for Bulgaria is Time Shelter, and this was really highly recommended in my previous video as well, because this actually won the International Booker Prize last year, and I love the concept of this book. Time Shelter is all about creating this place that is a clinic for the past, and basically these two researchers create these time shelters in order for Alzheimer's patients to feel like they've been transported back in time, and it can help with their memory and maybe perhaps be a treatment for Alzheimer's. And I really enjoyed the whole first half of this book, and that as a setup is so intriguing because it's all about replicating the past in such like stunning accurate detail that things become almost confused. And then this book just, I feel, goes off on a complete, like, I couldn't have foreseen where it was going, and I almost couldn't keep up with it in terms of like the intellectual leaps that it was making. So although it was incredibly interesting as a concept, I found that I wasn't actually enjoying this book, especially in the second half. And I also feel like I have a pretty like okay knowledge of what's going on in Europe and what has gone on in Europe for the last like few decades, but the references that is being made in this book, you would have to have such detailed knowledge about the history and the politics of basically every single country in Europe and basically for the previous 50 years, because a lot of it was just quite complicated and then going over my head. So this one, while not for me, I could imagine people reading it and absolutely loving it, because I really liked the writing in the first half. It just slipped away from me, this one, but that is Time Shelter. So next up, I want to talk about Croatia, and the book that I read for Croatia is Dark Mother Earth, and this is actually a book that I've never heard anyone else talk about, but I absolutely loved this book. So Dark Mother Earth is all about this writer, and he has written two very well-received books. They've been very successful. His third book has completely flopped, and then his girlfriend has broken up with him because he can't stop lying. And so the thing that makes his books so successful is also the thing that's kind of ruining his own personal life. And he begins not to even be able to tell the difference between truth and lies. And he also has big holes in his memory, and he has to go back and kind of confront things in his past. This was so gripping. I absolutely loved it. I love the writing style, and it really amps up in like intensity as you go through the book. I can highly recommend this one. It's also incredibly well rated. Like, people that have read this book really do like it, but it's just like not very, I've never heard other people talk about it. And then next up we have Denmark, and for Denmark I read one of the classic Danish authors, and that is Hans Christian Andersen. I've read a few of the fairy tales over the years, but the one that I actually wanted to read in full was The Snow Queen. The Snow Queen has just been adapted so many times and so many different things that I've seen that I wanted to actually go back to the source material, and honestly it's so different than I was expecting, but I loved it. Although these are fairy tales, they do have like this deep, like quite insidious side to them. And it was also just very, like, it's obviously very whimsical, but also has a lot of like hidden darkness to these stories. And it's just crazy that this book was written in 1844 and it's still like so well beloved today. But this story is about two young best friends, Gerda and Kai, and it's about what happens when one day Kai is carried off by the beautiful and cruel Snow Queen, and it's about Gerda trying to get him back. So yeah, I loved it. I'd highly recommend. Next up we have Finland, and I have a few different books for this one. First off, I want to talk about Tove Jansson, who is a Finnish author that I've read a few different books from and absolutely love, like potentially a new favourite author. Gonna have to read a few more books from them, but this is one of their adult books, which is the summer book that I've talked about a bit on this channel already. And then they also wrote all of the Moomin books, which I am so excited to like dive more into the Moomin world. And I'm obsessed now, and these books are really fun. They have really good illustrations in them, and they are just like absolutely bonkers as well. I just absolutely love the Moomin books. So these are obviously children's stories, kind of children's, like they're kind of children's, but they have a lot of heart to them. Like the best kind of children's stories, you know, when it's like there's real stakes going on in these Moomin books. But basically these stories just follow the Moomins, who are on the front cover here, and the various adventures that they get up to. I can't wait to buy more of these books and read more about the Moomins, and they're just adorable, and I'd highly recommend. Then also we have their adult books. So this is the summer book, which I also read this summer, and this is all about a grandmother and a granddaughter and the summers that they spend on this very remote island in Finland. And it's kind of reads as short stories or little kind of vignettes about the conversations that these two are having, the little adventures that they're having, and you just absolutely feel the love between these two. And so much of the reflections on like life and love and family and religion and relationships are just so touching, and also the nature as well of them living on this very remote island that you can see. This is actually the island that it was based on, because the book itself I think is based on her niece and her grandmother, I think. So yeah, would highly recommend those for Finland. I would slightly less recommend, but still like recommend to some people, the next book for Finland, and that is The Year of the Hare. So this is the one I actually read first for Finland, and I really wanted to read it because it was said to be really funny, and for a lot of the books in this challenge, I'm often reading quite dark books and classics. So I was like, oh, if there's a highly recommended Finnish book that's funny, I'll definitely read that. And I don't know if maybe just I don't get the Finnish humour, because I don't think I laughed at it. Basically, this is about this man, and he's just like not loving his life. He doesn't like his job, like he's getting into arguments with his wife. And then one day he's like out on an assignment and his car hits this hare. And instead of just like letting it die, he picks up this hare and like takes it with him. And this leads him on this entirely bizarre journey where he quits his job and he just travels around the country with this hare, and they get up to like ridiculous kind of... So I'm not sure if I just didn't kind of get it. Like nothing was bad about this. It's like a very middle of the road book for me. Not pun not intended there with the hare in the road. It was a middle of the road book. Like it just didn't quite work for me. So if you are looking for a Finnish book, I would definitely recommend the other ones that I spoke about above those. But if you did love it, then let me know. So next up, I want to talk about Sweden, and obviously we have to talk about the most famous Swedish author, which is Fredrik Backman. This is the person who's always recommended to me when I do this reading challenge and I ask for recommendations for different countries. So I've read a couple of Fredrik Backman's books. Previous one that I read, which is A Man Called Ove. I think it's Ove? A Man Called Ove. Something about this book that is so beloved by other people, I just really didn't like. Basically, A Man Called Ove is about this man, and he's not old, first of all. This is one of my issues with this book. He's like in his late 50s. And he's a very miserable person, and he's kind of given up on life, and he only really cares about the rules that he puts in place for his life, and he can be quite rude and abrupt to everyone else. But then one day a young family moves in next door to him, and through his friendship with them he kind of opens himself back up to life. It sounds like such a sweet story, and it is quite sweet. I think for me it was like overly sentimental and overly sweet in a way, and I don't feel like I liked this main character at all. Like he had no reason to be as grumpy and as mean as he was, and I know a lot of his background is explained in the book, but I just found him quite irritating. He did not charm me in any way, which means that I couldn't really get emotionally invested in this book. That being said, I have recently read a different book from Fredrik Backman and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars and I cried. and that book is And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer. And it's actually a novella, it's very short, and this book I feel like just touched exactly the perfect level of sweet sentimentality and heartbreaking, and just absolutely worked, and I was in floods of tears at the end of this book. So this story is all about 3 different generations. It's about a grandfather, a son, and a grandson. And it's all about the grandfather battling with dementia and this family learning how to say goodbye. It is devastating. It's very, very beautifully written. I think its length was also perfect for the punch that it was packing, and I would just highly recommend this book. It's really, really wonderful. They're the only Fredrik Backman books that I've read. I have read another book from Sweden, and that is Days and Days and Days by Tone Schunnesson. I would recommend this to people who are in the mood for something a little bit more fun and silly and gossipy maybe. This book is all about a woman, and she's kind of used to be a reality TV kind of social media star. She is like rapidly losing all of her money, and then her boyfriend breaks up with her and she just has absolutely no money. She has to raise like 50,000 kroner, I think, in the space of a week to be able to keep her apartment, and it's just her like going about her life. This one was quite fun. I enjoyed it. I think if you're more in the mood for something along this lines, then you should definitely check it out. But if you're just gonna do one for Sweden, then maybe I wouldn't recommend this one over the others. Next up, I want to talk about Ireland, and I have a good few books here to talk about for Ireland because Ireland has so many amazing authors. So I've read many Irish books, but here's a few of my favorites. A new to me author that I've been reading quite a lot of lately, and that is Claire Keegan. So here I have Foster, and I also have So Late in the Day. Claire Keegan's written many books, and also she often writes short little books, and I just love something about the way that she writes. It's got this real like simplicity, and obviously they're very short, so they have to pack a lot in. Like every sentence is it's like very simple, but it's also like very sharp. In Foster, you're following a young girl who is sent to live with relatives on a very rural farm for the summer, and it tells the story about this girl who's maybe been ignored before in her family home finally getting some of the attention and love that she deserves. And then in So Late in the Day, it's a very different type of story, and this is following a man as he goes home from work and he makes himself dinner, and you kind of just spend the evening with him as he's reminiscing about a previous relationship that he's had. This is talking about social expectations and relationships between men and women, and it's quite soft and quite sad as well. So next up, of course, we have another very famous Irish author, and that is Sally Rooney. I know some people absolutely adore Sally Rooney. I'm a little bit more hit and miss with her. I did enjoy Normal People a lot, but my favourite Sally Rooney so far has been Beautiful World, Where Are You? She often writes about kind of slightly complicated, more morally grey characters, people that can be a little bit selfish and a little bit complicated. She writes about young people living in Ireland and kind of just dealing with their everyday lives. I do love that her books feel so current. She's always talking about things that are going on, things that I genuinely care about in my own life. In Beautiful World, Where Are You? You're following 2 best friends as they're sending emails to each other, and you're also following 2 men that are in their life as well. So there's 4 main characters in this. And yeah, I just absolutely love this one. My favourite of the Sally Rooney books that I've read. I've also read her other one, which the name of it is eluding me now, but I didn't like that one as much, which is why I don't own it. Next up, we have another Claire, and it is Claire Kilroy. So I read this recently. This is Soldier Sailor. It was nominated for the Women's Prize for Fiction this year, and this is such a unique book, and I think for some people it will really work, and for some people they probably shouldn't and like really wouldn't like reading it. This is all about a woman who has given birth and she is raising her very young child. It is such a zoomed in view of this bond between the son, who is Sailor, and the soldier, who's the mother. It is so uncomfortably close up at times about this bond that they have that is so full of love but also fear and guilt. It's about the strain that having their son is putting also on this marriage, and it's just exploring this woman's life as her life is completely turned upside down and she loses kind of all sense of who she is as a person without her young son. So like I said, it's incredibly intense. As someone who's decided not to have children, I am glad I read this book because it does give me another perspective. If you've recently had a baby, maybe it might be a little bit too much because it's very, very unflinching, but still an incredibly written book. So that is Soldier Sailor. There's a few other amazing Irish authors that I can recommend, and like hundreds of others I'm sure that I'm missing out. The ones that I've already talked about would be my recommendations, otherwise we'll be sitting here all day. Next up, I actually actually talked about this country previously, but I want to talk about it again because the country is Poland. So last time I spoke about how I kind of made a little mistake with the book that I chose, and I was planning on reading is this next book, and I actually have now read it, so I can fully recommend Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead. I absolutely love this book. This was so highly recommended in the comments on my last video, and for good reason. I was completely obsessed, and this one was such a build up for me. Like, I was enjoying the book at the beginning, but it was like kind of one of those books that really creeps up on you, and then I didn't realize until I kind of finished it and closed the last page that I was like, oh my god, that was everything. Like, that had everything that I loved about a book. So this book is all about this woman, and she lives in a very remote Polish village, and she kind of takes her walks around the village and she looks after people's empty houses. She cares also very deeply about nature and about the animals that live around her. And then one day at the very beginning of this book, her neighbour dies and begins this murder investigation throughout this village. But I hesitate to call this kind of a murder mystery book because it's not anything like a murder mystery, I would say, even though it does have elements of that. A lot of this is more like a meditation on like the forgotten people in our societies as well. It talks about animal rights and marginalized people and hypocrisy, traditional religion, also horoscopes and kind of predestination. There is so much in this book and I absolutely loved it. So this is my recommendation for Poland. Next up we have another one that I want to kind of redo actually, because in the last video I was talking about the Netherlands and I couldn't recommend the one that I actually was talking about. But I've recently read another book from the Netherlands that I loved and I can definitely recommend. And that book is The Safekeep. I just recently read this and I really, really loved it. So I feel like I want to give the Netherlands like another chance, because the one I previously read was The Discomfort of Evening and I just absolutely hated that book. So this one though, I can wholeheartedly recommend. The Safekeep is all about this woman called Isabella, and she lives in this house and her mother has died and her two brothers have moved out and she just lives alone in this house. She's a very like strictly exacting woman. She has everything exactly how she would like it. Then one day her brother asks if his girlfriend can come and stay with her for a month, and this woman is the complete opposite to our main character. She is loud and messy and she sleeps late and she says unpredictable things. This puts like a huge strain on Isabella by having her in the house, and this is also set in the years after the Second World War in the Netherlands. There's so much going on in this book and I almost don't want to tell you too much about it because I think it's such a fun and surprising read. I read this literally in one day because I couldn't put it down. So I would highly, highly recommend The Safekeep. I love this book. So next up, I want to talk about France. And obviously there's so many French books and French classics. I just want to talk about a couple that I have read for France. And I want to talk about two children's books that I've read for France, and that is Madeline, which I absolutely love. And I actually read this in French to test my French, and I was like making notes as I was going along to like test my French so that I could learn it. But this was really, really fun and one of my favourite movies as a child. I absolutely love Madeline, so can highly recommend that. And I also read The Little Prince, which also this copy is in French, but I have read the English version because it was a little bit too wordy for my like French talent. So Madeline is about a French schoolgirl, orphan, and kind of the adventures that she gets up to. In this first one, she has to go to hospital, and then the series carries on from there if you've seen the film. And then The Little Prince is all about this little prince, and he basically goes to different planets, and he goes to Earth and talks to different people and learns about loneliness and friendship and love, and it is absolutely adorable. In terms of other French books, I want to talk about another couple of classics. I have read The Phantom of the Opera, and this one actually I wouldn't really recommend. I think that I have already watched and really enjoyed the like adaptions of this book, and I do think it's like one of the rare cases where adaptions are actually better because you can hear the music. When you read this as a story, it just comes across in a very different way. Obviously, if you know the story, it is about a Phantom of the Opera who's an opera ghost, and he is visiting this like very beautiful, very talented singer and helping her sing. I don't know, like even the quote on the back, like, "Christine, you must love me." The vibes are different when you read the book. Like, I think that a lot can be forgiven when you can actually hear the music and kind of, I don't know, I think that a screen adaptation is actually better for that book. And the other book that I want to talk about is this big old chunky boy that is The Count of Monte Cristo. Another classic that I absolutely love, and one of the books I've definitely talked about on this channel before because it's one of the big books that I actually really recommend that you do read. I do think it's really, really worth it. Although it's absolutely gargantuan, it's kind of split up and set up into a lot of different adventures, and it's pretty fast paced actually for how ginormous it is. So this book is all about Dante's, and he is just about to be married and get a promotion at work, and then all of a sudden his life comes crashing down and he is falsely imprisoned. And he is in prison for 14 bitter years where he is trying to plot his revenge on the people who have put him there. And that's all I want to tell you because it's a wild ride and it's so fun, and I highly, highly recommend it. Maybe not for this challenge because it would be very intense to read like a 1,500 page book for this reading challenge, but in general you should read this in your life. So the last country that I want to talk about for the Europe continent is Bosnia and Herzegovina. So actually for this country I am still planning on reading this book that I have read only a couple of chapters of, and this is The Bridge Over the Drina. But I really wanted just to quickly talk about this book that I have already read. This is Black Butterflies, and this technically does not count for this challenge because I believe that Priscilla Morris, it's her family who is from Bosnia, and she herself, I think, was born in the UK and has not lived there. But this is a story about the siege at Sarajevo. I'm so bad at pronouncing things. This story is set in 1992, which is the beginning of the siege of Sarajevo. In this book, you're following Zora, who lives in a flat with her husband, and when the war begins breaking out, she sends him and her family to safety in England, but she stays behind because she has a few things that she wants to wrap up for work. But before she realizes it, the city is under siege, and then she has no chance of escape. And this book to me was all about living in like completely exceptional circumstances, but still having to go on with your everyday life and how you can do that and maintain your humanity and dignity in that way. Like watching the city around her that she loves kind of crumbling, but then banding together as a community, and she's an artist and that really has an impact on the story. And I just absolutely loved this book, so I would highly recommend it. And if you don't have the same kind of strict rules as me, then maybe you can count this for your challenge. But the one that I'll actually be doing is going to be The Bridge Over the Drina, which I can't tell you too much about yet because I'm like 2 chapters in. Okay, so let's move on to the next continent. We are going to be talking about Asia, and the first country that I want to talk about is China. And so the book that I read for China is The Three-Body Problem, and I'm so glad that I read this book for China because I absolutely loved it. And also I was worried because this is a sci-fi book. I was worried that I wouldn't be learning as much about China by reading a sci-fi, but I couldn't have been more wrong because The Three-Body Problem is set during the Cultural Revolution in China. You might be more familiar with The Three-Body Problem now. There is a Netflix adaptation. I think it's Netflix. There's a new adaptation out of this, and I've watched a couple of episodes and it's okay, but I just loved this book so much, and it is a sci-fi like no other. So I really don't want to tell you too much about what this book is about because part of the joy of reading it for me was like the extremely hard-earned reveals that happened in this book. It is a sci-fi like no other because it's an intensely political book and it's very philosophical, and there is also a lot of science in this book, but it's almost science and mathematics to the point of like hyper-realism. Although a lot of it is kind of fictional, it's like so based on our world as we know it, and then extrapolating from there and from the ideas that are currently being grappled with and then pushing them to their limits. And I just absolutely loved it. It's not the most fast-paced or adventurous kind of sci-fi. It's a very slow story, but I just absolutely loved it. And I'm trying to think about how to talk about it without telling you anything about what it's about. I feel like I need to do a full proper review of this book, and I read it a few months ago, but I'm definitely carrying on with this series. I cannot wait to jump back in and see how the ideas and how the plot evolves. I can 100% recommend The Three-Body Problem for China. Next up, I want to talk about Vietnam, and the book that I read is The Mountains Sing. This book, unfortunately, is kind of one of those, it's like the genre of book that I just don't get along with, and I can really understand why other people like it and like love stories like this, but just stories of this specific subgenre I don't get on with that well. This is set in the 1970s in Hanoi in Vietnam, and you are following a young girl as the war is breaking out in Vietnam, and Also, you're following her grandmother who is remembering what it was previously like during the war in Vietnam. I think the reason primarily why this one didn't work for me, especially at the beginning, is you're starting the book and it's dealing with incredibly heavy, really sad, devastating topic. The issue is it's throwing you in with all of this really dark subject matter with characters that you don't even know yet. So a lot of the kind of emotional impact is lost. And then also you kind of it's never let up from that one point of really bad things happening to these characters, which is devastating to read. But just for me, I think I need a little bit more of a pull. I need to know who these people are a little bit more before, like, if I'm going to be pulled along for an actual, like, the thread of the story. And that was kind of like my other issue, is that I wasn't as engaged in the story element, because I'm just a bit fussy with like quite lyrical, multi-generational family drama stories, that kind of thing. So I'm probably being a little bit fussy, but this one just kind of wasn't really for me. Next up, we have another one that unfortunately wasn't for me, and I am the only person in the world, I think, that doesn't really like this book. But the country is India, and the book that just unfortunately was not for me is The God of Small Things. And so sad, because I actually love this cover. Like, that is so stunningly beautiful. And if I would have liked the inside of this book as much as the outside, then we would have been golden. I think for me, I probably read this at a time where I just couldn't quite like dive in deep enough, because the way this is written is incredibly lyrical and very wordy. So what I was saying was, this book is all about these two twins and about them growing up in Kerala in India with all of their like very kind of disjointed and strange family, and their young cousin comes to visit them one day from England, and they learn the hard way that everything can change in just a day. This is just one of those books I think that everybody says is like a breathtaking masterpiece, and I'm sure that they are right in a way, and that I've just missed something, because I can't, like, everyone can't be wrong. But I'm not sure. Like, I've never heard anyone say that they didn't like this book, and I just didn't love it. Like, I can't even really say why, because I just didn't have like very strong feelings about it either way. It's not like I hated this book. I just did not love it either. So this is unfortunately one that did not work for me, but this did win the Booker Prize in whatever year that it was, like quite a few years ago now. So yeah, sadly that one did not work for me. Next up, I want to talk about Syria, and the book that I read for Syria is As Long as Lemon Trees Grow. This one, again, did not work for me, and I feel like I've just got the wrong opinion. I did enjoy this one more than the last two that I was just talking about, but this one is a young adult book, and I'm just not sure. I just hit myself in the face. I'm just not sure that it worked, because it's talking about an incredibly difficult topic, which is the war in Syria. Doing so in a way like with two young people who are also falling in love, and just like, anyway, so it's about this girl who is living in Syria, and when the revolution happens, she hasn't yet finished her studies, and she is, I think, just a pharmacy student, but she is basically having to be a full-blown doctor because there is no one else left to help people in this hospital. So she works there every single day doing everything she can for the people around her. She is incredibly torn whether to stay and continue to help, or to try and leave Syria and get out of the country, because her best friend and also sister-in-law is heavily pregnant, so she wants to also protect her best friend. I think a lot of how it was written was good. I just really didn't enjoy the romance that occurs in this, but more specifically a lot of the dialogue I found myself like quite cringing at. I'm not sure if anyone else is going to relate to that. I also feel like a lot of the beginning of the book about her really pulling between like, should she stay or should she go? She's obviously dealing with so much in her day-to-day life, and the way that is expressing itself is also kind of through a hallucination as well. And I was really engaged in a lot of this like real pull and push decision that she was making, and like being alone and having all that pressure on her. Like, that was all written really well. I just don't feel like the way that we got to the end of the book made sense for kind of how the setup of the story was. So I don't want to spoil anything and go into like a lot of detail about the books that I don't love as much, but maybe we can talk about it in the comments. If you did love this one, we can talk about this. So next up, I want to talk about Palestine, and I've read a couple of books for Palestine. The first one is Minor Detail. So this is a short, slim little book, and it is a kind of book of two stories. The first part of this book is following a group of Israeli soldiers in 1949, and you're following as a group of soldiers capture a young Palestinian woman. And then the second half of the story, you're following the story of a woman who's a researcher. She reads about about this incident in 1949, and she gets obsessed by some of the minor details about this incident. And then she travels throughout Palestine trying to figure out more detail about what happened on this day. This book is incredibly well written. It is very, very powerful. The first half of this story is written in such a way that it will make you feel so physically uncomfortable. The way that the senses are used in this first part, in particular smell, is so visceral. It feels like you are transported there. And then the second half of this book is written in a slightly different style. As you're following this woman, she is kind of following her instincts about trying to find out more about this case, but she knows that she's putting herself in danger by trying to find out more information. Even though she knows that, she's still pushing that way anyway. I can highly, highly recommend this one. I feel like everyone should read it, and it's a really important Palestinian book. And then the other book that I've also read for Palestine more recently is Enter Ghost, and I also really love this story too. This is about a woman who is living in London and her life kind of hits rock bottom. She goes through a terrible breakup and she is in the theatre industry, and she decides to go and visit her sister who's still living in Palestine. And then as she gets there, she quickly kind of gets caught up in the theatre scene that's going on in Palestine. She gets involved in a production of Hamlet that is going to be put on the Gaza Strip. I think this book is so important. It's really talking about identity and art and creativity and family and like what home can mean to someone. I can highly, highly recommend it. So the next country that I want to talk about is Turkey, and we actually read this book as part of the Reading Around the World book club. So if you're interested in this challenge, then you might already know, but I host a book club over on Fable where we read a book from a different country for every single month. And so obviously I've read a lot of the books for this challenge with the book club, and it's been so much fun. Also just for suggestions, people suggesting books to read for different countries, and it's really nice to read along with other people who are also doing this challenge. And the link is always in the description if you do want to join that book club. For this month, for September, we are currently going to be reading for the country of Ecuador, and we are reading The Inheritance of Orcadia Divina, so I'm very excited about that for this month. So the book that we read for Turkey is The 40 Rules of Love by Elif Shafak, and unfortunately I've decided that I don't think Elif Shafak is for me as an author. It's the second book that I've read by them. I also read The Island of Missing Trees, and I did not love that one either. I just think it's something about the writing style that I don't personally get on with. But this book is good because it got me really interested in reading more about Rumi and Rumi's poetry, because basically this story is all about a kind of disgruntled housewife called Ella, and she's realizing that she's lived a life without love. She's kind of lived her life for her husband and her children and not really for her own joy. And she gets a part-time job working freelance for a literary agency, and as part of that she reads a manuscript, and this manuscript is all about the poet Rumi, who is a 13th century poet. Actually more it's about Shams of Tabriz, who is Rumi's kind of lifetime companion, best friend, I guess. So this book itself is kind of a book within a book, and the book inside the book to me was a lot more interesting, the story of Rumi and Shams of Tabriz. But unfortunately a lot of it really didn't work for me by the end, because a lot of the book is not actually about Rumi, who is I think the more interesting character, and it's not even really about his poetry. The book is much more about Shams of Tabriz and how he is a wandering Sufi, and he has these 40 rules of love, and he's trying to spread his kind of gospel to people, which is pretty interesting. But he in the end kind of comes across as like a very character who just like knows absolutely everything and can kind of never do any wrong, and he doesn't really feel like a real person. And so he goes to find Rumi because he knows somehow that Rumi is going to become like the most celebrated poet of all time, and he kind of like puts Rumi through different tests and things, and I don't know, just something about this book didn't quite work for me, and I'm not totally sure like author was intending with a lot of it. I am now much more interested in Rumi's poetry, and I've read a couple of poems since I've read this book, and I really do enjoy Rumi's poetry, so that's a good thing. But I just think that Elif Shafak is not for me as an author. So that is Turkey. Next, let's talk about Singapore. So for Singapore, I read a very fun book, and the book that I actually read is Crazy Rich Asians. So this has been adapted and is one of my favourite rom-coms. So I thought for Singapore I would go back and actually read the source material as well. So if you're familiar with the rom-com, it's exactly the same setup, but this is a satirical like rom-com book. It is about these incredibly rich, privileged Chinese Singaporean families, and about the girl who is dating the son, but she has no idea that he is like incredibly rich until she goes to visit his family. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was very fun. It was perhaps too long for me, but I did enjoy it. I do think though that the movie is better. Like, it's another one where like I do actually think that the movie adaptation is better, but it was still a very fun read, and I'm glad that I did read it because also it gave me a break from some of the heavier books that I do read for this challenge. So it's fun to read like a fun satirical comedic book. That is Crazy Rich Asians, which is incredibly shiny as well. So next up, let's go to the Americas, and I'm including Central, North, South within this. So firstly, let's talk about Argentina, and I've read a few different Argentinian books with kind of varying levels of success, I would say. So the three or four different Argentinian books that I've read are The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. I've also read Elena Knows, and I've also read Not a River. I've actually read 2 books now by this author. I've read her most recent book that's just come out, or is about to come out, which is called A Sunny Place for Shady People. Out of the 2 though, I did prefer The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. But out of the 3 kind of options I've got here, this one was my favourite. So Elena Knows is all about Elena, and when her daughter is found hanging in the church. In her grief, Elena is trying to find out what happened to her daughter, because Elena knows that her daughter would never have committed suicide. But Elena is suffering from a condition that means it's very difficult for her to investigate herself. So this book takes place over a single day as Elena is traveling throughout Buenos Aires trying to find someone to tell her what's happened to her daughter. And the way that it's written about Elena being kind of stuck inside her own like failing and aging body is so well done, and it's like very uncomfortable at times. And this book is about whether or not people can change, and kind of complicated mother-daughter relationships and disability, and I just thoroughly enjoyed this one. So that is the first one for Argentina. I also read Not a River. This one explores male friendship, and it's about these men who are going on this fishing trip, and they haven't yet been back on this fishing trip since 3 years ago when a tragedy happened. It is a very like magical realism story, and it's talking about masculinity in Argentina, and I really enjoyed it. It's also quite a short read, so I would recommend this one. And then we have The Dangers of Smoking in Bed and also A Sunny Place for Shady People. These are both short stories, and they are horror themed short stories. Unfortunately, these didn't actually work that well for me, especially the newer collection. I didn't love that much because they weren't creepy enough for me. They didn't make me feel creeped out and scared. This one did more for me. And like some of the stories in this have really stayed with me. For me, I feel like I'm quite easily freaked out, and I didn't get too creeped out by these horror stories. So next up, I want to talk about Venezuela, and this is another book club book that we have done. And the book that we did for Venezuela is It Would Be Night in Caracas. This one unfortunately was a bit of a miss in the book club as well. This is all about a woman, and her mother has just died, and her mother is the only person she has in this world. So she makes her way home from the funeral, and she finds that people have broken into her apartment and have moved in, and she has been kicked out. One thing I did like about this book is I did learn a lot about Venezuela through this book, because you get the flashbacks to her childhood, where it felt like Venezuela was a very different place to the current time that this book is set in. And at times, reading about the modern Venezuela, it felt like it was like reading a dystopian book, because it is about this woman just like pure struggle for survival. So this book was good, it just wasn't like my favourite. I felt quite distant from the main character, who remained quite mysterious to me throughout. I would also check trigger warnings as well, because it's quite a dark story. Next up, I want to talk about Chile, and perhaps it is easy to guess who I want to talk about for Chile, but that is of course Isabel Allende, and I've read 2 books by Isabel Allende. Allende? I'm not sure how you say her name. I first read The House of Spirits, which is I think one of her most famous books that she's had out, and the second one that I read is Violetta, which is a much more recent book, I think. So let's start with The House of Spirits. This is one of the classical like magical realism stories, and if you enjoy Gabriel Garcia Marquez's books, then you will definitely enjoy this. I have a bit of a tumultuous relationship with those books, and I similarly felt about this book as well. I wish I could have loved this book more, but I also do think it's that multi-generational family story that just doesn't work for me, I think. This story basically spans 4 generations of the same family and tracks the course of the country throughout that time as well. And it is magical realism, but that is really dropped much later in the story, and maybe that's done like very purposefully, but I just feel like the whole magical side of the story had completely gone. And we were really focusing on like a few of the characters that I absolutely hated by the end of this as well, which I think really like tamped down on my enjoyment. And then Violetta is about a woman who is called Violetta or Violetta, I don't know how I'm saying her name, and she has lived for 100 years and she's basically kind of just going through the story of her life. Honestly, I read this a while ago and I basically can't remember much about it, so that's kind of like, I liked it at the time, it was fine, but I don't know if I can like strongly recommend this because a lot of the detail has slipped away from me. I'm trying to speed up because the sun is going down. I've been filming for hours. Next up, I want to talk about Costa Rica, and it's another book club book, and we read, I feel like we've done so many book club books for like South America, but this is Where There Was Fire. This is a recent read that we did for the book club. I think this is last month's, and this is all about Costa Rica, and this is set in the 1960s, and basically it is about this huge fire that happened on this banana plantation, and it is following a family that is caught up in the tragedy of this fire. So you're following the time when the fire is happening, and then also you're following like decades later, kind of the next generation looking back. I quite enjoyed a lot of the like mystery components of this story, and I liked some of the more like comedic characters that were involved, but the second generation, I just feel like some of the characters I just could not get behind. Like they were being like very entirely selfish, and I just like did not enjoy reading from their perspectives. A few people though in the book club absolutely loved this one, and I can see where they were coming from as well, so this was like a very good one to read as a book club as well. Next up, the last one that we're doing for the Americas, the next country is Uruguay, and I read Pink Slime. This one I was also slightly disappointed in, despite being like one of my most anticipated books of the last few months. This is a Uruguayan novel, and basically it's a dystopian story about this port city where this red wind like periodically comes in and can basically strip the flesh off the people and give them this horrifying disease. And it is about this woman, and it is basically about her trying to look after this young boy as best she can. But again, I'm having similar feelings. Like I did not know this woman, and also a lot of her decisions, she was like creating her own bad luck, if you know what I mean. Like she was doing absolutely nothing to get out of this bad situation, and I just don't think I got on with the writing style. So unfortunately this did not work for me as well. I am speeding up because we are moving on to the Caribbean, and I'm trying to wrap up this video before the sun goes down. So for the Caribbean, I have two books that I want to talk about, and the first one is Barbados, and the book that I read for Barbados is How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House. This one really reminded me of the other Caribbean book that I read for Trinidad and Tobago, which is The Bread the Devil Need, and I kind of get them both mixed up in my head, but when I remember them, I preferred The Bread the Devil Need. So this book revolves around a murder that happens on a Barbados beach, and it follows a few different characters who are involved in this murder, and it is like very dark story. It's like unflinching in its talking about like incredibly vividly describing very, very dark themes, so I would make sure that you know what you're getting in for. And also I think that the reason I didn't love this book as much is because it is one of those books where just terrible things happen to every single woman in this book, and it is just like a story of like very sad and tragic things happening to women and violence against women, and yeah, it's like, so it is very powerful and it's well written. I read it relatively quickly, but just like one that I would be hesitant to recommend. Okay, and then the final book that I want to talk about for the Caribbean is for the Dominican Republic, and the book that I want to talk about is Clap When You Land. But I've actually just looked up, and the author of this book is American. I don't believe that she was born in Dominican Republic, so I'm hesitant to actually talk about this book, but I will anyway because we're here now. This is the story about two sisters, one who's living in America and one who's living in Dominican Republic, and they do not realize that they are sisters until their father, who travels between them secretly, dies in a plane crash from America to the Dominican Republic. And also this book is entirely written in verse, which is like the first book that I've ever read that has that, so it does take some getting used to, but I would highly recommend this. This is a young adult book and it is really beautiful, but I don't want to recommend it for this challenge because I've just realized I don't think I can count it for the Dominican Republic. So if you have other suggestions for books for Dominican Republic, then please let me know, because it looks like I'm in need of a book to cover for this country. So I think that is every single book that I wanted to update you on today. There's obviously a few that I've not yet talked about that I have read from, like England, my own country, in America, like the USA, and a few others. So I will be doing another update video quite soon, or not that soon. Let me know how often you want these update videos, if you'd rather have shorter ones of me updating more regularly, or if you'd rather have a long old video where you can kind of skip around within the countries and see like if you're trying to find something specific, and I'll just like do it in one big long video. Let me know what you'd prefer. Also, please remember to like this video if you haven't already. It really helps me out. And also please subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. I would be so grateful. We're coming up close to 4,000 subscribers on this channel, which I'm very excited about. So that is all from me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.